there, it's me, SpongeBob. Welcome to Sleepy Sponge Lore, a place where the secrets of Bikini Bottom drift like dreams beneath the waves. So take a deep breath, get comfy, and let the ocean carry you to sleep. Let the video begin.
It began with a sound so soft, so ordinary, that no one else paid much attention to it. A single bubble rose from the sand floor of the sea, round and trembling, carrying with it a faint echo, almost like a sigh. The boy noticed it long before anyone else ever would. He had a way of lingering over things that others ignored, the curve of a seashell, the silence between the hum of waves, the strange shimmer of light bending through the water. And on that day, when the bubble floated up from the sand and wavered before him, he felt a kind of stillness settle inside his chest, as though the ocean itself had leaned closer, offering him a secret. He reached out with cautious fingers, not to grab, but simply to steady. The bubble trembled against his hand, fragile yet determined, before it slipped free and continued upward. He watched it until it vanished against the blur of the surface light. The boy could not explain why, but he felt certain the bubble had listened to him, that it carried not just water and air, but a small part of the thought he had been holding in his heart. He had been lonely that morning, though he never said the word aloud, and now it seemed as if the loneliness itself had been lifted, carried away by the bubble's delicate skin. He tried again the next day. This time he cupped his hands in the water, pressed his lips to the surface, and blew. The sound was clumsy, the shape awkward, yet a bubble formed all the same. It spun gently as it rose, silver edges shimmering in the deep light. He whispered a word into it before it slipped free. Nothing complicated, just hello. And when it vanished above him, he felt again the odd comfort of something having been carried away, as though even the simplest word could travel farther than his own reach. The days unfolded like this, slowly, quietly, until the practice became part of him. He discovered that the bubbles seemed to shift shape, depending on the way he moved his hands, the rhythm of his breath, even the feelings he held in his chest. On days when laughter surprised him, the bubbles seemed to spin with brighter light. On days when he was heavy with silence, they wavered, thin and fleeting. Yet still they rose, unwilling to linger in sadness. The boy learned to listen to the silence between each attempt. He noticed how the water seemed to change around him when he blew carefully, gently, as though the sea itself approved of his patience. Over time, he grew less focused on whether the bubbles were large or small, perfect or flawed. What mattered was the way his heart felt after each one drifted free, lighter, less tangled, more at ease. It was during these quiet experiments that he first imagined building a place just for the bubbles. The sand beneath his feet was soft, and the tide left driftwood scattered near the coral edges. He gathered a few pieces, awkwardly at first, setting them upright in the sand as though marking a boundary. Soon he had formed a little frame, nothing grand, nothing more than a boy's plaything. But when he stood before it, he felt a warmth he could not name. It was not a booth for selling or trading. It was a stage, a place where his breath and the sea could meet, where each bubble could rise in its own dignity. He spent days smoothing the wood, pressing shells along the base, humming softly as he worked. There was no hurry. The sea never hurried him. When the stand was finished, uneven and creaking though it was, he placed himself in front of it with reverence. He pressed his lips together, breathed slowly, and let the first bubble rise from his own bubble stand. It was small, imperfect, yet when it floated away, he smiled as if it were the first bubble he had ever made. Others noticed, eventually. Neighbors passing by wondered at the odd frame he had built. Some shook their heads and muttered, amused by his strange invention. Others watched quietly from a distance, unwilling to join but unable to look away. And though the boy never announced himself as a teacher, never claimed to know anything worth passing on, Something about the bubble stand drew attention, softly, steadily, like the pull of a gentle current. Each morning, he returned to it, whispering to the sea, shaping his breath into shimmering orbs. Each bubble seemed to carry a secret not fully explained, a message written in silence. Sometimes he imagined they carried pieces of memory, the way his mother had once hummed to him, the laughter of a friend, the calm weight of a starry night above the water. Other times he thought perhaps the bubbles were simply bubbles, nothing more, and yet his heart insisted otherwise. When one burst too quickly, he did not frown. He would simply try again, finding joy in the attempt. He began to notice that failure itself carried a kind of beauty, the way a bubble collapsed into a shimmer, leaving nothing behind but the chance to try again. It was never wasted, never meaningless. Each breath, each bubble, was part of something larger than he could explain. The bubble stand became his quiet companion, a ritual that steadied him. It was there he lingered after long days when the sea felt heavy and uncertain. It was there he returned after moments of joy, eager to share his laughter with the waiting bubbles. And always they rose. Always they carried something away. His sadness, his happiness, his silence, upward, outward, into a place beyond his reach. He did not know in those early days that others would one day join him. He did not know that a skeptical neighbor would come, or that laughter shared with a friend would change the rhythm of his practice. All he knew was that each bubble mattered. Each one was alive in its own fragile way, a reminder that even the smallest things could carry meaning. And so the boy kept blowing, patient and unhurried, as the bubble stand grew into more than wood and sand. It became a place where dreams lingered in round, fragile forms, rising into the light. And though he could not name the feeling, somewhere deep inside he knew. The bubbles were not just his anymore. They belonged to the sea, to the silence, and perhaps one day to everyone who dared to pause and breathe with him. The bubble stand had become a quiet anchor in the boy's days, though he never truly planned it that way. What began as scraps of driftwood pressed into the sand had started to feel like a doorway into something larger, something he could not yet name. He would stand before it with the patience of one listening for distant music, shaping bubbles into being, watching them drift upward with their fragile courage. Each one carried a shimmer of mystery, and though he didn't fully understand why, he felt steadier for having made them. Others passed by from time to time, their eyes catching on the odd frame of wood rising from the sand. Some slowed their steps, curious, but most shook their heads and walked on. What use could such a contraption possibly have? It was easier to dismiss it as a child's pastime, a distraction, than to notice the gentle devotion in the boy's movements. He did not try to persuade them otherwise. He was content with his stand, with the ritual of breath and release, with the silence that followed. Yet even contentment has its edges. There was a small ache, a longing the boy could not quite chase away. He wanted someone else to see what he saw, not just the bubbles themselves, but the quiet way they carried pieces of him into the sea. It was not recognition he sought, nor praise. It was companionship, the comfort of knowing another heart could feel what his had felt. It was on one such morning, when the water shimmered pale and the seabed stretched wide and empty, that he noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the current. A tall neighbor, one who always moved with a kind of dignified distance, stood with arms crossed, watching. His eyes were narrowed, his mouth pressed thin, and his whole posture seemed to say, "I do not approve." Yet he did not leave. He remained, shifting slightly, pretending now and then to glance elsewhere, but returning always to the boy and his stand. The boy's heart lifted, though he tried not to show it. He moved carefully, deliberately, blowing another bubble with the same quiet patience. It rose round and calm, wobbling slightly before slipping upward. He imagined for a moment that perhaps this bubble could carry not just his breath, but a wordless greeting. "See me. Stay a while." The neighbor's face softened for just a heartbeat, but then hardened again, as if embarrassed by his own interest. He cleared his throat, muttered something about childish games, and turned as though to leave. But he did not take more than a few steps. His feet lingered, rooted by a thread of curiosity he could not untangle. The boy noticed this, and his smile deepened, though still he said nothing. As days turned into weeks, the neighbor's presence became familiar. He would arrive with an expression of irritation, arms folded, muttering about the noise or the silliness of it all. Yet beneath his complaints, the boy sensed a kind of loneliness, a yearning hidden even from himself. The neighbor never reached for the bubbles, never asked to learn. But his eyes followed every movement, the rise of a bubble, the shimmer of its skin, the way it drifted upward as if obeying a secret law. The boy began to feel a quiet responsibility. Without ever deciding, he performed his technique with greater care when the neighbor was near. He slowed his breath, shaped his gestures with deliberate grace, showing not perfection, but patience. He wanted the man to see that this was not a game. It was something softer, quieter, something that might loosen the tightness around his heart. One evening, as the sea dimmed into a twilight hue, the boy noticed the neighbor still standing nearby. He had been there for hours, though he pretended not to notice the passing time. The boy lifted his hands, breathed gently, and shaped the largest bubble he had yet made. It trembled in the water, wide and luminous, reflecting both of their faces on its surface. For a moment, it held them together, the skeptic and the dreamer, before drifting upward and vanishing. The neighbor said nothing. He turned his face away, muttered something about foolishness. But the boy saw the way his eyes lingered, the way his shoulders loosened ever so slightly. He understood that the man had felt something, even if he would never speak of it. And for the boy, that was enough. Not long after, another figure approached the bubble stand. This one was different, rounder, slower, filled with an easy kind of laughter that bubbled out before words could form. He did not stand at a distance. He came close at once, grinning, eager to join without hesitation. "What's this?" he asked, pointing at the wooden frame. His voice carried the simple joy of someone who never feared to look silly. The boy explained in his own way, not with long descriptions, but with a demonstration. He breathed in, blew out, and shaped a bubble that drifted free. The newcomer clapped his hands together, eyes wide with wonder.
"I want to try,"
he exclaimed, already leaning in. His attempt was clumsy, bursting before it left his lips, but instead of frustration, he only laughed, the sound filling the water with warmth. The boy laughed with him, their voices mingling like gentle currents. Together they tried again and again, each failure met with more joy, more laughter, until the sea itself seemed to hum with their delight. The neighbor, standing at his usual distance, scowled and crossed his arms tighter. But even he could not entirely shut out the sound of laughter, the way it softened the air. The bubble stand was no longer a solitary shrine. It had become a place of gathering, of curiosity and joy, of skepticism and secret yearning. Each bubble carried not just the boy's breath, but now the laughter of his friend, the silent watching of his neighbor, the first fragile threads of connection. And though he could not name it yet, the boy sensed that something was changing. The bubble stand was no longer only his, it was becoming part of something greater, something shared. And so he returned each day with the same reverence, the same patience, knowing that every bubble built upon the last. Each one was a step forward, even if no one else could see it. The boy understood now that this was not only about him. It was about what the bubbles invited others to feel, the laughter, the stillness, the small mysteries they could not explain. And as the stand stood quietly in the sand, its wood creaking, its surface smoothed by countless touches, the boy knew the journey had only just begun. The bubbles would carry him forward. The bubbles would carry them all. The days at the bubble stand unfolded with a rhythm that felt both ordinary and enchanted, as if time itself slowed when the boy and his companions gathered there. What had begun as a solitary ritual was now becoming a small circle of lives drawn together, each one touched in some quiet way by the bubbles that drifted upward. The laughter of his round friend filled the water with brightness, while the silent watchfulness of the tall neighbor anchored the space with an energy that was harder to name. The boy felt balanced between them, joy on one side, skepticism on the other, and in that balance, something beautiful was beginning to grow. The friend never tired of trying. Each morning he would waddle up to the bubble stand, grinning wide, eager to blow another bubble no matter how many had burst in his face the day before. His failures were as wholehearted as his attempts, and when the bubbles popped too soon, he only laughed louder, his eyes crinkling with a kind of joy that expected nothing but the moment itself. His laughter became its own bubble, carrying warmth upward into the sea, joining the shimmering orbs that danced above. The boy often found himself laughing too, not at the failures but at the way joy could bloom even from disappointment. The neighbor, of course, remained aloof. He hovered nearby, arms crossed, muttering whenever the laughter grew too loud. His voice was sharp, but the boy had learned to listen past it, to notice the way his eyes lingered on the bubbles even as his mouth dismissed them. There was a longing hidden there, a yearning that pressed against the hard edges of his pride. He wanted to belong, but fear or stubbornness, or perhaps both, kept him standing at a distance. One afternoon, as the water shimmered with golden light from the surface above, the boy decided to try something different. He turned toward the neighbor without speaking, lifted his hands slowly, and began shaping a bubble with deliberate grace. He breathed in deeply, let the air slip out with gentleness, and guided the bubble upward with both palms. It grew larger than usual, swelling with patience, until at last it floated free, spinning with a sheen of colors that shifted like a dream. The boy held the moment in silence, allowing the neighbor to see not just the bubble, but the care that had created it. The neighbor's eyes softened despite himself. He leaned ever so slightly forward, as though drawn by a thread he could not cut. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, his hand twitched, a tiny motion quickly hidden behind a fold of his arm. The boy saw it, though, and he smiled gently as if to say, "It's all right. You don't have to pretend with me." The friend, oblivious to the silent exchange, clapped his hands with delight and begged to try again. His bubble burst almost immediately, spraying him with droplets, and he erupted into laughter once more. The sound carried through the water, and for a fleeting moment, even the neighbor's stern mouth curved into something that almost resembled a smile. He quickly hid it, scowling again, but the boy had seen enough. He knew now that the bubble stand had reached him, however faintly. As the days turned to weeks, the bubble stand began to gather an unspoken reputation. Passers-by slowed their steps to glance at the wooden frame. Some stayed for a moment, curious about the strange ritual. A few even tried laughing when their clumsy attempts ended in quick bursts. Most drifted away soon after, but something lingered in their eyes, a softness that had not been there before. The boy noticed it with quiet pride. It was not the bubbles themselves that mattered. It was the way people felt while watching them rise. One evening, the neighbor stayed longer than usual. The sky above the sea had dimmed into a soft violet, and the water was filled with shadows that shimmered faintly with the last traces of sunlight. The boy and his friend had been blowing bubbles side by side, laughing and humming little tunes, when the neighbor suddenly stepped closer. His voice was sharp, meant to sound dismissive, but it trembled with something unspoken. "It's not so hard," he muttered. "Anyone could do it." The boy looked up, his smile patient. "Would you like to try?" he asked, his voice gentle, without challenge. The neighbor stiffened. He looked away, pretending to examine a shell on the sand. "I don't waste my time on childish games," he replied. Yet his feet did not move. His hands twitched again, betraying the truth he could not admit. The boy nodded softly, saying nothing more. Instead, he blew another bubble, slow and steady, and guided it upward. His friend followed with a crooked attempt, which burst almost instantly, and together they laughed. The neighbor's scowl deepened, but his eyes followed the rising orbs with a hunger he could not disguise. Finally, with a sigh heavy as the sea itself, he stepped forward. "Fine," he said brusquely. "Show me!" His voice was harsh, but beneath it lay a trembling note of vulnerability, like a shell hiding a tender center. The boy did not gloat, did not laugh, did not even smile too widely. He simply showed him, step by step, how to shape the hands, how to breathe slowly, how to let the air slip out as if it were a secret meant to be carried upward. The neighbor tried, stiff and awkward, his bubble collapsing before it even formed. His face darkened with frustration, and he turned to leave, muttering curses under his breath. But the boy reached out gently, not touching him, only speaking softly. "It's not about perfection. It's about patience. Try again." Something in the tone, so free of judgment, steadied the neighbor. He took another breath, tried once more, and this time a small bubble formed. It wavered, thin and uneven, but it rose. For the briefest instant, the neighbor's eyes widened with wonder. The bubble burst quickly, but the moment had already taken root. The boy smiled at him, warm and knowing. The friend cheered loudly, clapping and laughing, though the neighbor quickly shushed him. He crossed his arms again, muttering that it had been nothing, that anyone could have done it. But the boy saw the way his shoulders no longer carried the same weight, the way his gaze softened every time another bubble rose into the sea. From that day on, the neighbor did not always stay at a distance. He still scowled, still muttered, still pretended indifference, but now and then he would try again, each attempt carrying more care than the last. And though he never admitted it aloud, he had joined the circle, however reluctantly. The Bubblestand had become more than a frame of wood and sand. It was a place of laughter and quiet breakthroughs, a place where skepticism bent into curiosity, where failure became part of joy, where even the most guarded hearts found themselves drawn into fragile orbs of light. The boy felt it growing, not as a grand monument, but as something far gentler, a shared ritual, a secret bond, a small act of wonder that tied them all together. And though he could not yet see where this path would lead, he sensed that each bubble carried them forward, building upon the last, guiding them towards something deeper still. The sea was listening, the bubbles were teaching, and the Bubblestand was no longer just his. The morning settled softly over the Bubblestand, the light spilling through the water in muted golds and blues, carrying a calmness that seemed to pause the world itself. The boy arrived, as always, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying the quiet anticipation of someone about to speak to a friend who already knew the words. The friend, round and ever cheerful, bounced beside him with barely contained excitement, while the neighbor lingered with folded arms, pretending indifference but leaving just enough space for curiosity to seep through. Each day the ritual unfolded with a rhythm that had become sacred in its simplicity. Yet that very simplicity now seemed pregnant with new possibilities. It was during one of these early mornings, when the water shimmered with a silver haze and the seabed looked almost endless, that the boy noticed something remarkable. The bubbles no longer simply floated upward in gentle arcs. They began to linger, twisting ever so slightly as if hesitating to leave, their surfaces reflecting faint echoes of the boy's gestures, the friend's laughter, and even the neighbor's muted sighs of wonder. He paused mid-breath, captivated by the way a single bubble seemed to carry more than air. It held a trace of intention, a memory of the hand that had shaped it, a fragment of the heart that had sent it skyward. He had not tried anything different. Nothing in his routine had changed. And yet the bubbles had begun to take on a life of their own, responding to his focus, to the laughter around him, to the quiet attentiveness of someone who had not yet learned to speak openly. The boy realized slowly, with a kind of reverent awe, that this was the first true lesson the sea had ever given him, that even the smallest things, shaped with patience and care, could grow beyond the scope of expectation. The friend bounced closer, eyes bright with curiosity. "Did you see that one?" he asked, pointing at a bubble that had lingered near the surface, spinning in a slow, deliberate orbit before drifting upward again. "It didn't pop." He laughed as if the very fact of its survival were a miracle worth celebrating. The boy smiled quietly, his attention still on the next bubble he would release. "They're listening," he said softly, almost to himself. "And sometimes they respond." The neighbor, who had been standing at his usual distance, watched the exchange with a tightening in his chest. He had never admitted to himself that he cared, but seeing the way the bubbles seemed to reflect the emotions around them unsettled something deep inside. He shifted, pretending to examine a shell, but his gaze kept returning to the boy's hands, to the subtle curving of the air, to the way a bubble could linger just long enough to feel like more than itself. That day, the boy decided to experiment further. He bent low to the water, cupping his hands carefully, and blew a bubble so gently that it trembled and spun with a fragile elegance. Instead of letting it rise immediately, he guided it through a slow, deliberate path, tracing circles above the stand, hovering near the friend's hands, brushing ever so lightly against the neighbor's foot without touching. The bubble caught fragments of their movements, their sounds, their tiny hesitations, and carried them outward in a dance that seemed almost conscious. The friend squealed in delight, reaching to touch it, but the boy gently guided his hands away, smiling. "Let it carry itself," he whispered. "Let it feel its own path." They watched in silence, mesmerized, as the bubble floated higher, capturing the light in a way that seemed almost impossible, soft reflections of laughter, quiet longing, and the simple wonder of being alive. For a moment, even the neighbor held his breath, caught between disbelief and the flicker of something tender awakening inside him. As the days passed, the boy realized that each bubble carried more than shapes or colors. They had begun to absorb something intangible, fragments of hope, traces of care, whispers of joy and quiet contemplation. When a friend laughed near them, the bubbles shimmered brighter. When the neighbor exhaled a deep sigh of skepticism, a tiny ripple passed through them, bending their path subtly, almost imperceptibly. The boy understood, without ever needing to speak it aloud, that this was not just practice or play. It was a lesson in empathy, in noticing, in shaping the unseen currents that connected hearts without a single word. He began teaching the friend, carefully, how to do the same, not by instructing mechanically, but by encouraging him to notice. "Feel it," he said, "not with your hands, not with your eyes, but with what's inside you. The bubble will answer if you're quiet enough to hear." The friend tried, laughing, failing, bursting his bubbles over and over, but the boy guided him gently, not correcting but showing through example. And slowly, almost magically, a bubble formed that hovered, lingered, and carried a shimmer of the friend's laughter outward, spinning as if it understood the joy behind it. The neighbor remained reluctant, watching from a distance, but the boy had begun to notice something subtle, a shift in posture, the way his eyes softened when a bubble lingered too long, the small hesitations that betrayed the curiosity he tried to mask. The boy said nothing, only continued to guide his own hands and breathe slowly, sending another bubble skyward. It hovered a moment, spun slowly, and drifted toward the neighbor's feet, brushing past ever so lightly. The neighbor's breath caught. He did not move, did not speak, but his stiff shoulders softened fractionally. And in that quiet, unseen moment, the boy realized that even the most guarded hearts could be touched gently by patience and care. From that day onward, the practice of bubbles took on a new depth. The boy, the friend, and even the reluctant neighbor began to participate, each in their own way, sometimes silently, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with quiet frustration. Each one learned to shape not just the bubbles, but themselves. They discovered that a bubble was more than air and water. It was a carrier of emotion, of memory, of tiny pieces of life meant to be shared. And so the Bubblestand continued to grow, not in size but in meaning. It became a place where patience and empathy mingled with joy and laughter, where the shyest observer could find themselves reflected in the shimmering orbs above, where even the most distant heart could bend toward wonder. The boy understood now that the Bubblestand was no longer merely his creation. It was a conduit, a bridge between what was seen and unseen, a quiet testament to the power of gentle care. And though he did not yet know where this path would lead, he sensed deep in his chest that the bubbles were preparing them all for something greater, something that would not require words, but would demand presence, attention, and the simple, profound act of breathing life into fragile things. The sea watched, the bubbles listened, and together they were shaping more than air and water. They were shaping hearts. The days at the Bubblestand grew longer, but they were never hurried. The sunlight shimmered through the water like golden threads, tracing the contours of sand and coral, touching the wooden planks with warmth. The boy arrived, as always, careful and deliberate, carrying the calm patience that had become a quiet ritual in itself. His friend followed, bouncing with laughter, eager to start anew, while the neighbor lingered nearby, folded arms softening just enough to suggest a curiosity he could not hide. Each bubble that rose from the stand now seemed to carry not just air, but an echo of the space around it, a reflection of laughter, of patience, of the gentle attention that had grown between them. The boy had begun to notice subtle changes. It was not only the bubbles that responded to the world, but the people themselves. The friends' laughter, once clumsy and scattered, now had a rhythm that harmonized with the boy's movements, as though their hearts had learned to move together in a quiet dance. Even the neighbor, who maintained his mask of skepticism, shifted imperceptibly when a bubble hovered too long, a small crease of wonder appearing on his brow before he quickly flattened it. The boy understood that the act of shaping bubbles was no longer just a practice in patience. It was becoming a mirror, reflecting back what each of them carried inside. One afternoon, the friend attempted a particularly ambitious bubble. He pressed his lips to the water's surface, held his breath, and blew with all his strength. The bubble emerged, trembling and uneven, wobbling like a delicate ship on gentle waves. It swayed and twisted, almost as if unsure of its own existence, before bursting mid-air. The friend's laughter broke through, a sound so pure and unguarded that it seemed to lift the entire water around them. The boy smiled, not correcting him, for he knew that the beauty was not in the perfection of the bubble, but in the willingness to try, in the joy that filled the spaces between attempts. The neighbor, standing slightly apart, exhaled in a way that was nearly a sigh. He muttered something under his breath about foolishness, yet his hands twitched as he watched. There was a small longing in the way he lingered, a pull he could not resist, though pride kept him rooted to the spot. The boy understood this kind of quiet resistance. He had learned that hearts open slowly, in increments too subtle for words to measure. And so he continued, shaping his own bubbles with gentle care, letting them rise and spin, carrying fragments of thought and feeling with them. It was during one of these mornings, when the sea glimmered with the softest green and gold, that the boy noticed something extraordinary. One of his bubbles, round and trembling, had not risen immediately. Instead, it hovered near the surface, caught in a delicate balance between water and air, spinning slowly as if listening. The boy reached out, holding his hands just beneath it, and for a moment it lingered there, responding to his touch without touching, moving with a grace that seemed conscious. He could feel the faint pulse of connection, not just to the bubble, but to the space around him, to the friend's laughter, to the neighbor's quiet observation, to the gentle rhythm of the waves themselves. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "They're more than air. They're more than water. There's something in between, carrying pieces of us all." The friend, leaning forward with wide eyes, nodded earnestly, understanding more than the words could convey. The neighbor did not reply, but his gaze softened, betraying the faintest hint of wonder. The boy realized then that the bubbles were not simply objects to be shaped. They were bridges, tiny vessels of empathy, carrying fragments of heart and intention outward for the world to see. From that moment, the boy began to guide his friend more deliberately, not through instruction but through example. He showed him how to breathe slowly, how to let the hands curve naturally, how to imagine the bubble as a carrier of thought rather than a mere trick of water and air. The friend tried again and again, failing and laughing, until finally a small bubble formed that lingered for a long, exquisite moment. It wavered, reflected the light, and then floated upward, carrying with it a tiny echo of joy, a trace of wonder, a hint of connection. The neighbor, who had been standing just beyond the reach of this new bubble, shifted slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that he had noticed. He did not speak, did not attempt, yet he remained close enough to feel the gentle pull of discovery. The boy recognized this as an unspoken participation. The neighbor was learning to open, even if only in the smallest of ways. He smiled quietly to himself, understanding that patience was not passive. It worked slowly, imperceptibly, but always with effect, and often where it was least expected. Days flowed like this, each one building upon the last. The friend's laughter became steadier, the neighbor's watchfulness a gentle presence, and the boy's own hands learned to shape bubbles with an ease that mirrored his growing understanding. Every attempt, every misstep, every delicate orbit of a bubble carried with it a story, a memory, a fragment of life. And in this way, the Bubblestand was becoming a quiet sanctuary, a place where emotions could take form and rise, where the invisible threads between people were made visible in shimmering, spinning spheres. One evening, as the sky above the sea dimmed into a soft violet, the boy released a bubble larger than any he had made before. It rose slowly, catching the fading light, spinning and wobbling as it ascended. For the first time it seemed to respond to not just his hands, but to the presence of his friend, to the neighbor lingering nearby, to the quiet hush of the sea itself. It hovered in place for a long moment, suspended in gentle balance, and in that pause the boy felt the full weight of what had been growing all these days. Connection, empathy, patience, and joy, they were all carried upward, fragile yet unstoppable, in the small, perfect orbit of a bubble. The friend clapped and cheered, while the neighbor finally allowed himself a small, unguarded smile, fleeting yet genuine. The boy watched them both, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight or water. The Bubblestand had become a place where hearts met quietly, where the smallest acts could ripple outward, where the most delicate creations could hold more than their form suggested. And as the bubble drifted beyond sight, shimmering faintly against the fading light, the boy understood that this was only the beginning. The lesson of the bubbles was no longer about skill, or about laughter, or even about patience alone. It was about understanding, about presence, about the quiet transformation that occurs when care and attention are offered without demand. And in that knowledge he felt the weight and beauty of what lay ahead, knowing that each rising bubble carried not just air and water, but the seed of something far greater. The mornings at the Bubblestand had grown quieter in the sense of awareness, though never in sound. The friends' laughter still bubbled brightly, a sharp contrast to the neighbors' watchful stillness, yet both now blended with the boys' own careful rhythm, creating a subtle harmony that filled the space with something unspoken. Each bubble released into the water no longer felt like a mere trick or pastime. It had become a messenger carrying fragments of their hearts, traces of their attention, and the invisible warmth of shared presence. The boy had begun to notice how even the smallest shift in his breath could alter a bubble's path, how a subtle flick of a hand could change its shimmer, and how the presence of another, even at a distance, could guide its movement with no physical touch at all. It was on one of these serene mornings. The water tinted soft green with golden light filtering through the surface, that the boy realized the bubbles were responding not only to their hands, but to their emotions. He had shaped a particularly large orb, steady and round, and it paused mid-ascent, wobbling gently before rising again. For the briefest moment, it seemed to hold its shape as if listening, mirroring the calm patience in his chest. The friend clapped excitedly at the display, his laughter scattering in joyous fragments across the sand, and even the neighbor's lips twitched in a way almost imperceptible, betraying a tension that no words could convey. The boy watched carefully, sensing that each bubble was learning, in its own fragile way, to carry intention. He gestured slowly, allowing a stream of smaller bubbles to follow the larger one, each catching hints of laughter, hesitation, and quiet admiration. The friend leaned forward eagerly, attempting to mimic the movements, his own bubbles wobbling and bursting too soon, but the boy guided him with soft encouragement. "It's not about perfection," he whispered, his voice blending with the gentle hum of the water. "It's about presence. Every bubble carries something of you, whether it holds or bursts." The friend's eyes widened with comprehension, and he blew again, slower this time, letting his breath move like a tender current through his hands. A bubble formed rounder than before, shimmering with the faintest rainbow of colors, hovering just above his palms before rising to join the larger one. The boy smiled, not with pride, but with quiet acknowledgement of the small victory, knowing the magic lay not in the skill, but in the care taken with each attempt. The neighbor remained at the edge, folded arms softening slightly as he observed the process. His stance was stiff, but his eyes were attentive, tracing the movements of each bubble, noticing the way laughter, care, and patience seemed to ripple outward through the water. The boy knew this was progress in its own subtle form. The neighbor's distance was a shell, but even a shell could be warmed from the inside by patience and observation. He would not join yet, but the tides of attention had shifted. As the day unfolded, the boy experimented with guiding the bubbles through gentle arcs and loops, tracing invisible paths in the water. He discovered that the friend's energy could amplify the buoyancy, laughter giving lift and spin to the fragile spheres. The neighbor's tension, conversely, created a slight resistance, causing bubbles to wobble before moving forward, as if the water itself responded to the unspoken emotions around it. The boy realized that this delicate balance, the joy, the skepticism, the careful guidance, was teaching them all something far beyond bubble technique. They were learning empathy, patience, and subtle communication without words. One afternoon, as the light dimmed into a soft violet, a particularly large bubble formed in the boy's hands. It hovered, trembled, and then began to spiral slowly, catching glimpses of the friend's wide-eyed wonder and the neighbor's reluctant attentiveness. The boy guided it gently toward the friend, and then toward the neighbor, observing as it wavered, responding to their emotions as much as his own. It was no longer just an experiment. It was a reflection of the space they shared, a delicate mirror of attention, care, and presence. The friend, bouncing with enthusiasm, reached for it, and the boy carefully adjusted its path so it would respond to the touch without popping. The friend's laughter rose like a song through the water, a melody that seemed to infuse every bubble with a playful energy. The neighbor, watching silently, allowed a faint smile to break through, the first clear sign of softened walls. The boy did not comment, did not instruct. He simply observed, letting the moment teach them all in ways words never could. Days turned into a rhythm of gentle discovery. The friend's attempts became steadier, more intentional, while the neighbor lingered with less rigidity, observing carefully, occasionally reaching a hand closer, almost testing the invisible current. The boy realized that the bubble stand had evolved from a solitary experiment into a subtle school of presence. Each bubble carried the imprint of attention, the echo of care, the reflection of shared wonder. And in this evolution, they were all growing, learning to notice, to respond, to hold space for one another without the pressure of expectation. The boy began to see that the technique itself was only the beginning. The bubbles were teachers, tiny vessels of awareness, reminding him and his companions that the most profound lessons are often simple: patience, observation, empathy, and quiet joy. The friend, the neighbor, and the boy were bound in this fragile ritual, each learning from the other, each reflected in the shimmering spheres that floated skyward. By the evening, the bubble stand rested quietly on the sand, holding the echoes of laughter, attention, and gentle curiosity in its simple wooden frame. The boy gazed at it with reverence, knowing that the space had become something larger than any of them, an intimate sanctuary where the invisible threads between hearts could be seen, shaped and released bubble by fragile bubble. And though he could not yet predict what would come next, he understood that the true magic lay not in the rising orbs themselves, but in the care with which they were sent into the world, carrying pieces of the heart, fragments of attention, and the quiet warmth of shared presence. The mornings had taken on a rhythm so gentle, it almost seemed as if the sea itself was breathing with them. The boy arrived at the bubble stand with hands already knowing the shapes they would make, yet still discovering subtle nuances in each breath and gesture. His friend bounced eagerly beside him, his laughter spilling like sunlight across the sand, while the neighbor lingered, not quite hidden, yet hesitant to fully approach. The trio had settled into an unspoken pattern, one of observation, attention, and quiet learning, where the most profound lessons were carried not by words, but by the rising, shimmering bubbles. It was during one soft morning, when the water shimmered in muted shades of turquoise and gold, that the boy noticed a peculiar behavior. The bubbles had begun to linger longer, almost as if they were curious about what lay beyond their fragile shells. One hovered near the surface, spinning gently as though observing the movements of the boy's hands, then drifted toward the friend, catching fragments of his laughter in its delicate shimmer. The boy reached out, guiding it subtly, and felt a quiet recognition. The bubbles were no longer just tools of practice. They were becoming companions, reflecting the energy and attention of everyone present. The friend squealed in delight, attempting to mirror the movements, his own bubbles wobbling and bursting in chaotic arcs. Yet each failure carried joy, not disappointment. The boy guided him with soft encouragement. "Let it move with you, not against you," he whispered, letting the friend's energy infuse the sphere rather than trying to control it. The neighbor, standing slightly apart, observed closely. Though he said nothing, a subtle shift had taken place. His stance, once rigid with skepticism, now held a soft tension, as if he were learning to anticipate the dance of the bubbles without fully acknowledging it. For hours, they continued, forming delicate chains of bubbles that spiraled upward, weaving invisible patterns in the water. The boy began to notice that each bubble responded not only to their hands, but to the emotions that flowed through them, the friend's delight, the neighbor's cautious curiosity, and his own calm focus. They had become conduits, channels through which subtle currents of energy and care passed, and the boy realized that the true power of the bubble stand lay not in technical skill, But in presence, as the sun climbed higher, the boy experimented with a new approach. He formed a bubble and, instead of sending it immediately upward, guided it in a slow, deliberate path over the sand, hovering near the friend's hands and brushing lightly past the neighbor's feet. It trembled in the water, caught fragments of sound and motion, and seemed to absorb a trace of their shared attention. The boy whispered softly, almost as a secret, "They can feel us, if we are still enough to let them." The friend's eyes widened in wonder, and even the neighbor's lips curved faintly, betraying a reluctant admiration. The friend's attempt that day was unusually focused. He shaped his bubble with care, breathed slowly, and watched as it lingered longer than any he had made before. It reflected the light of the morning, caught traces of the boy's calm energy, and hovered near the neighbor, who instinctively reached out, hand trembling, before withdrawing with a quiet laugh of frustration. Yet the act alone, even without perfect execution, had an effect. The bubble seemed to settle, spinning gently, absorbing the smallest fragments of their attention and reflecting them outward into the shimmering water. By afternoon, a subtle transformation had begun. The neighbor, usually distant and hesitant, moved closer, curiosity overtaking pride in small increments. He watched more intently, occasionally holding his hands just above the sand, testing the currents without fully committing. The boy noticed, and, in a quiet gesture of trust, allowed a particularly large bubble to hover near his chest, then drift slowly toward the neighbor. The orb wobbled slightly before stabilizing, as if acknowledging the tentative connection. The neighbor exhaled, a breath carrying both tension and wonder, and for the first time allowed himself to participate, guiding a bubble carefully, even if briefly. The friend, oblivious to the subtle shift, laughed and clapped, forming a series of small, playful bubbles that danced around them. The boy smiled softly, understanding that each rising sphere carried more than air and water. It held joy, curiosity, patience, and care. The bubble stand had become a living lesson, teaching them all the value of presence, empathy, and shared attention. Even failure now held beauty, because it was part of the rhythm of learning, of noticing, of being together. As the day waned, the boy released a final bubble, larger and steadier than any before. It rose slowly, catching the fading sunlight, hovering near the friend and neighbor in a delicate balance. For a long moment, it held them together, not physically, but emotionally, tethering their attention and hearts in quiet communion. The boy felt a gentle warmth in his chest, the kind that comes from witnessing growth, from observing the subtle unfolding of understanding that cannot be hurried or forced. The friend clapped in delight. The neighbor smiled faintly, and the boy knew that something deeper was unfolding. The bubble stand was no longer simply a place of practice. It had become a sanctuary, a space where hearts could meet gently, where attention and care were made tangible, where even the most guarded could begin to open. The bubbles had taught them patience, empathy, and presence, and in return, the boy understood that they were learning too, not only to shape air and water, but to notice the delicate currents of one another's hearts as the sun dipped low, casting golden shadows across the sand. The boy looked at his companions, at the fragile wooden stand, and at the rising orbs that floated toward the surface. Each bubble was a small, perfect lesson in connection, in presence, in quiet wonder. And in that moment, he realized that the bubble stand had become far more than he could have imagined. It was a gentle bridge between hearts, a living rhythm of care, patience, and discovery, and a reminder that even the smallest acts, offered with attention and kindness, could ripple outward in ways both visible and invisible. The mornings had begun to feel like soft breaths of the sea itself, each one carrying a hush of possibility. The boy approached the bubble stand with a calmness that had deepened over the weeks, a quiet understanding of the rhythm that governed the rising spheres. His friend bounded ahead with the usual bright energy, laughter spilling into the gentle currents, while the neighbor lingered with a hesitance that was no longer rigid, softened now by curiosity and quiet admiration. The stand had transformed, subtly but unmistakably, from a simple wooden frame into a vessel of shared attention, a place where presence and care could be shaped as delicately as any bubble. That morning, the boy noticed something new. The bubbles, which had already seemed aware of intention, now lingered with a kind of gentle persistence. One orb, round and trembling, paused mid-ascent, hovering near the friend's outstretched hands before drifting toward the neighbor. The boy held his breath, feeling the faint pulse of attention, the quiet dialogue carried without a single word. The friend squealed in delight, chasing the floating sphere, while the neighbor's lips curved in a small, almost imperceptible smile. The boy realized that the practice had begun to transcend mere technique. It was now a subtle conversation between hearts, mirrored in fragile spinning orbs of air and water. He began to experiment with guiding bubbles more deliberately, shaping paths that intertwined and overlapped, creating arcs that seemed to dance with the energy of all three participants. The friend laughed and followed along with abandon, the joy in his movements adding lift and spin to each sphere. The neighbor watched closely, the careful attention in his eyes betraying a growing desire to participate, though pride still held him at the edge. The boy smiled quietly to himself, understanding that transformation often came in increments too subtle to measure, and that patience, like the slow rise of a bubble, was its own reward. For hours they continued, weaving trails of bubbles that shimmered with the colors of sunlight and laughter. The boy showed the friend how to release a bubble slowly, letting it tremble and wobble just long enough to catch the light. And he guided the neighbor in the same way, careful not to impose, but simply to offer a model of presence. The neighbor's first successful bubble wobbled precariously before drifting upward, and he let out a small, reluctant exhalation of satisfaction. He did not boast, did not smile too broadly, but the boy knew the significance, the first fragile acknowledgement that he could be part of this quiet, shared rhythm. As the day unfolded, the boy noticed a pattern emerging. The bubbles, when shaped with care, seemed to carry the emotions and attention of the participants outward, reflecting back small shifts in energy and intention. Laughter caused them to wobble and shimmer. Concentration steadied them. Doubt made them tremble. Each one became a living indicator of presence, a mirror not only of skill, but of the subtle currents flowing between hearts. The boy felt a quiet awe at the realization, understanding that the stand, the bubbles, and their shared attention had created a gentle ecosystem of emotional resonance, fragile yet profound. That afternoon, as the water glimmered in muted shades of turquoise and gold, the boy attempted a particularly delicate experiment. He formed a bubble larger than any he had tried before, holding it just beneath the surface, guiding it with careful, slow movements. It wobbled and spun, reflecting the light, the friend's laughter, and the neighbor's hesitant attention, and hovered as though listening. For the first time, the neighbor leaned forward, his hands slightly extended, tracing the bubble's movements. He did not speak, but the act alone signaled a quiet shift, a tentative openness to connection, a willingness to engage with the fragile dance of presence. The friend, caught up in the moment, squealed and clapped, his energy infusing the bubble with subtle lift, while the boy guided it with steady, deliberate hands. The neighbor's first fully successful bubble rose with a wobble, catching a glimmer of sunlight before drifting skyward. His breath caught, a mixture of surprise and satisfaction, and he glanced at the boy and friend, eyes softened, lips slightly parted. The boy understood that this was more than practice. It was the first real acknowledgement that even a guarded heart could begin to trust, to participate, to let something delicate rise without fear of failure. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the boy allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. He watched the friend and neighbor both engaged in the slow, delicate shaping of bubbles and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight. The bubble stand had become a place of subtle transformation where patience, attention, and care flowed outward in tangible, visible forms. The orbs of air and water carried fragments of joy, curiosity, empathy, and understanding, teaching them all the value of presence without a single word. By evening, the stand rested quietly on the sand, holding the echoes of laughter, attention, and tentative connection in its fragile wooden frame. The boy released a final bubble, large and round, guiding it gently to float between the friend and neighbor, a silent bridge of shared experience. For a long moment it hovered, shimmering with the faintest colors, reflecting the emotions and intentions of all three. The boy felt a quiet exhale, a satisfaction that came not from skill, but from witnessing growth, the small, delicate transformations that occur when hearts are given the space to rise like bubbles into the light. And as the last light of day shimmered across the surface of the water, the boy knew that this was only the beginning. The lessons of presence, empathy, and quiet attention would continue to unfold, each bubble carrying fragments of their hearts into the world, teaching them to notice, to connect, and to trust in the subtle, transformative power of gentle care. The sea was patient. The bubbles were attentive, and together they were shaping something far greater than any of them had imagined. The mornings at the bubble stand had begun to carry a weightless serenity, a quiet kind of wonder that settled over the sand and water like a soft mist. The boy arrived with hands familiar with the gentle choreography of rising spheres, and with a heart increasingly attuned to the subtle currents of presence and care that flowed between them. His friend bounced ahead with unrestrained joy, laughing freely as he reached for the bubbles, while the neighbor lingered, no longer just at the edge but closer, still hesitant, yet undeniably drawn in. The stand itself seemed alive with the echoes of patience, laughter, and quiet attention, a place where even the smallest gesture carried meaning. That morning, the boy noticed something he had not seen before. A single bubble, larger than any he had attempted recently, floated upward, but then paused in mid-water, spinning gently, almost as if weighing its next movement. It hovered between the friend and the neighbor, catching the light and reflecting fragments of their expressions: curiosity, delight, cautious wonder. The boy reached out, cupping his hands around the trembling sphere without touching it, and felt a resonance, a tiny pulse of acknowledgement from the bubble itself. He whispered softly, "It's listening. It knows we're here." The friend clapped in delight, eyes wide, while the neighbor's lips curved into a small, unspoken smile. For hours they continued this delicate ritual. The boy guided his hands slowly, shaping trails and arcs, while the friend's laughter infused the bubbles with a buoyancy all their own. The neighbor, meanwhile, experimented quietly, releasing small orbs that wobbled, trembled, and eventually rose in fragile perfection. The boy observed carefully, noticing how each bubble responded not only to motion, but to the intentions, the emotions, the subtle attention of the trio. It was no longer mere play. It was a conversation, a dialogue without words, carried in fragile spheres of air and water. That afternoon, the boy attempted an experiment that required patience beyond any previous practice. He shaped a bubble and guided it in a slow, circular path over the friend's hands, brushing near the neighbor's feet, and then back again. The orb trembled and spun, reflecting fragments of sunlight, laughter, and silent attention. It lingered longer than any bubble had before, and for a moment the boy felt as if time itself had softened, stretching and bending around them. The friend squealed with delight, reaching to touch it, and the neighbor extended a careful hand, hesitant but willing. The bubble hovered between them, a fragile bridge of shared presence. The boy realized that the stand had become more than a place to shape bubbles. It was now a vessel for emotional discovery. Each attempt revealed something subtle about the participants, the friend's joy, unrestrained and infectious, the neighbor's cautious curiosity, slowly softening, and the boy's own growing awareness of patience, empathy, and the delicate art of holding space. Even when bubbles burst, the act was not failure but a gentle reminder of impermanence, a lesson in letting go and observing without expectation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the boy guided a final bubble into the air. It hovered, spinning slowly between his hands, the friend's outstretched palms and the neighbor's tentative reach. For a long, still moment, the three of them were connected through the bubble's fragile form. A shared attention, a subtle acknowledgement of growth, of trust, of the quiet joy of presence. The friend's laughter became softer, more steady, the neighbor's smile a little more open, and the boy felt a warmth that was not merely physical, but something deeper, something that rose from shared understanding and delicate care. By evening, the bubble stand rested quietly, its wooden frame holding the echoes of a day spent in observation, patience, and subtle connection. The boy released a final bubble, a large, steady sphere that floated upwards slowly, catching the last golden light of the day. It hovered for a moment between the friend and neighbor before drifting toward the horizon, carrying with it fragments of laughter, attention, and quiet wonder. The boy watched it ascend, feeling a calm exhale, a gentle satisfaction that came not from mastery but from witnessing the subtle, transformative power of shared presence. And as the last light shimmered across the water, the boy understood that this was only the beginning of something far greater. The bubble stand had become a quiet sanctuary, a place where even the smallest gestures, gentle hands, soft laughter, hesitant reach, could ripple outward in ways unseen, carrying fragments of heart and intention into the world. The friend, the neighbor, and the boy were learning more than bubble technique. They were learning the tender art of noticing, the subtle rhythm of patience, and the gentle shaping of connection. The sea was patient, the bubbles attentive, and together they were creating a quiet, transformative magic. The mornings had grown softer around the bubble stand, as if the air itself had learned to wait, to hush, to cradle the small rituals unfolding there. By now, the boy no longer hurried toward the wooden frame. He arrived as though answering a quiet invitation, each step carrying him deeper into a world that felt both familiar and strangely infinite. His friend was always there first, bouncing with laughter, and the neighbor lingered nearby, still half hidden in watchfulness, but closer than ever before. The three of them had become woven into the rhythm of this place, as though the bubble stand was gently teaching them how to be together. That morning, the boy lifted a bubble from the soapy dish with unusual care. It rose like a fragile pearl, trembling but steady, and he guided it upward with hands that moved more slowly than they once did. He realized something. His bubbles no longer burst as easily. They lasted longer, floated steadier, held their shape with a grace that seemed almost intentional. His friend gasped with delight, clapping in rhythm with each rising orb, while the neighbor's eyes widened in quiet astonishment. What had once seemed like a trick of air now felt like an unfolding language. The boy began to notice patterns. When his friend laughed, the bubbles seemed to rise higher, as if caught by joy itself. When the neighbor leaned in, cautious but curious, the bubbles hovered low, waiting as though they sensed the need for gentleness. And when the boy released them with calm intention, they drifted slowly, spinning lazily in the sunlight, reflecting fragments of sand and sea. It was as though the bubbles were not just shapes, but mirrors, carrying emotions, thoughts, and unspoken bonds within their delicate walls. For a while, the three of them played in silence. The boy shaped wide orbs that danced across the breeze. His friend leapt to meet them with outstretched hands, and the neighbor began to blow their own bubbles, small, careful but steady. One of them floated between the boy and the neighbor, pausing in mid-water. Neither reached for it, yet both watched with steady attention. And in that moment, the boy felt something stir. An understanding that the bubbles were not his alone. They belonged to all who approached with care, patience, and quiet wonder. Later, as the sun tilted higher, the boy attempted something new. He took a deep breath and shaped a bubble that stretched larger than any before, wider than his chest, its fragile surface trembling in the light. The friend gasped, backing away with awe, while the neighbor's hand hovered near, but did not interfere. Slowly, with deliberate motion, the boy guided the bubble forward. It moved as though alive, following the path of his hand. He led it past the bubble stand, across the sand toward the rippling water. The bubble touched the sea's surface, not with a pop, but with a shimmer, as though exchanging a secret, and then lifted again, unharmed, rising higher, carrying a reflection of the horizon within its curve. For a long while, they watched it drift until it was no more than a glint against the wide blue sky. The friend whispered, almost reverently, "It's like it knew where to go." The neighbor said nothing, but their eyes lingered on the boy, soft with something unspoken. The boy felt a warmth in his chest, not pride, but a deeper calm, as though the bubble had taught him a truth he had only brushed against before, that letting go was also a form of creation. That release carried its own quiet magic. The rest of the day unfolded with gentle experiments. The friend tried shaping bubbles with sudden bursts of energy, learning how quickly they burst when rushed. The neighbor leaned into patience, discovering how even a small bubble could last when offered steady attention. The boy moved between them, guiding, encouraging, and sometimes simply watching, noticing how their different approaches created different results. Each bubble was a reflection of its maker, and yet all of them were connected, rising together into the wide, forgiving air. By dusk, the three of them sat quietly near the stand, watching the last light bend across the sea. The boy released one final bubble, small and delicate, and let it drift upward on its own, without guiding hands. It floated between them, catching the colors of sunset, and then rose higher, wobbling, shimmering, until it vanished into the fading sky. None of them spoke for a while. The silence was not empty. It was full. A kind of shared knowing that did not need words. And as the evening deepened, the boy understood that something had changed. The bubble stand was no longer just a place to practice bubbles. It had become a place of quiet revelations, where each moment unfolded gently into the next, where laughter, patience, and silence carried equal weight. The bubbles themselves were teaching them not how to master, but how to listen to one another, to themselves, and to the spaces between. The sea whispered softly. The night settled around them, and the boy closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the lingering presence of the day's shapes still hovering in memory. He knew there were still mysteries left in the bubble technique, secrets that would only reveal themselves with time, care, and quiet attention. But for now, it was enough to have shared this day, to have grown together in fragile spheres of air and light, to have learned that even the most delicate of things could carry the heaviest truths. The mornings at the bubble stand had begun to feel like waking dreams, each visit softer, slower, more steeped in quiet wonder. The boy no longer thought of the bubbles as tricks of soap and air. They had become companions, teachers, almost like fleeting spirits. When he dipped his hands into the dish that day, he felt not only the coolness of water, but also a stirring, as though the surface carried echoes waiting to rise. His friend was already laughing, scattering small bubbles into the air, and the neighbor lingered beside them, not as hesitant as before, but not yet fully unguarded. Together they stood before the stand, unaware that this day would reveal something deeper than all the others. The first bubble of the morning trembled into being under the boy's careful breath. It was ordinary at first glance, small and round, glistening in sunlight. But as it floated, the boy noticed something unusual. Inside the shimmer, shapes began to form, faint, blurred, like distant reflections in water. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the shapes remained. Within the bubble, he thought he saw a memory, himself as a smaller child, sitting alone near the sand, humming softly while no one watched. The image was fleeting, gone the moment the bubble drifted higher and popped, but it left the boy strangely still, his heart thudding softly in his chest. He tried again, shaping another bubble, and once more the shimmer revealed something more than light. This time it was his friend, younger, chasing jellyfish with reckless joy, tripping and falling, but laughing even as sand clung to his face. The friend gasped when he saw it, pointing with wide eyes.
"That was me! I remember."
The bubble burst before he could finish, but the memory lingered between them, more vivid than before. The neighbor stepped closer, curiosity overcoming caution, and whispered, "Do they
"Show what we've carried?"
The boy didn't answer, for he didn't know. He only felt a deepening sense of reverence, as though the bubbles had shifted into something more sacred. Each one seemed to draw upon a thread of memory, weaving it into light, carrying it briefly into the open air before dissolving back into silence. The friend was delighted, begging for more, while the neighbor stood quieter, their gaze heavier, as if afraid of what might be shown. As the day unfolded, they each took turns shaping bubbles. The friend blew a cluster of small ones, and in one they all glimpsed his first timid step into the ocean, the waves kissing his ankles as he squealed with joy. The neighbor shaped one hesitantly, and in its fragile glow appeared the faint outline of a younger self, sitting apart from others, looking toward the sea with longing in their eyes. The bubble burst quickly, almost as if protecting the secret from lingering too long, but the boy noticed the neighbor's hand, trembling afterward. He reached out, not with words, but with a gentle bubble of his own, one that carried a softer memory, him and the neighbor, younger, crossing paths at the edge of the sand, exchanging the briefest glance that neither had ever spoken of. It was gone in a heartbeat, but the neighbor's expression softened, their shoulders easing, as though relieved to be remembered. The friend, watching silently now, seemed to understand too that the bubbles were no longer just play, but revelations, invitations into the fragile inner worlds they rarely shared aloud. By afternoon, the Bubblestand itself seemed transformed. The air shimmered with rising memories, bubbles reflecting fragments of childhood, tiny flashes of joy, loneliness, discovery. Some burst too quickly to grasp, others lingered long enough to touch their hearts before vanishing. The boy realized that each bubble was both a mirror and a release. To see a memory rise was to acknowledge it, and when it popped, it left behind a lightness, as though the burden of carrying it alone had softened. There was one moment that stayed with him most. The neighbor, after much hesitation, shaped a single bubble that floated slowly upward. Inside it was no clear scene, only the faintest shimmer of a lullaby, soft notes that none of them could quite name, but all of them felt. The boy recognized it as the sound of longing, of comfort once sought, perhaps never found. When the bubble burst, no one spoke. Instead, they sat together in silence, letting the feeling rest among them, unbroken, tender. As the sun descended, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, the boy guided one final bubble into the air. It shimmered brightly, and within its fragile shell appeared not a past memory, but something else. An image of the three of them together, standing at the bubble stand, laughter and quiet woven into their faces. The friend gasped, the neighbor's eyes glistened, and the boy realized this bubble did not carry the past, but the present, the now, the moment they were already living. When it finally burst, they all sighed softly, as though exhaling at the same time. That evening, as they walked away from the bubble stand, the boy felt a quiet shift inside him. The bubbles were no longer only tools of wonder or joy. They were windows into the tender, hidden layers of life itself. Each one carried a truth, however fleeting, and each bursting left them lighter, closer, more deeply seen. He knew tomorrow would bring new shapes, new revelations, but tonight he carried the memory of shimmering spheres filled not with soap, but with fragments of who they were and who they were becoming. The bubble stand greeted them the next morning with an air that felt different, hushed, as though it too had sensed the shift from play into something more fragile and profound. The boy approached it slowly, his hands resting for a moment on the worn wood before dipping into the basin. His friend was already there, brimming with laughter as always, but even he seemed quieter today, his joy softened into reverence. The neighbor stood closer than ever before, no longer hovering at the edges but woven into their circle, though their silence carried a weight that words would not touch. Together they began, knowing without speaking that something awaited them. The first bubble of the day rose quickly, round and bright, and for a moment the boy expected it to hold a memory, as the others had. But this one was different. Its shimmer did not reveal the past, but something ahead, his friend standing taller, older, his smile steady and kind, guiding others with the same playful joy he now poured into laughter. The friend gasped when he saw it, eyes widening with both delight and a tremor of disbelief.
That hasn't happened yet, he whispered, his voice almost trembling.
The bubble popped before either could say more, but the echo of its image lingered, settling quietly into their heart. The neighbor was the next to try. Their bubble floated slowly, quivering in the morning light, and within it unfolded a scene that none of them had seen before. The neighbor, seated beneath the sea's edge, surrounded not by solitude, but by companionship. Others gathered around them, listening, leaning close. The neighbor's breath caught, and for the first time their eyes glistened with tears, not of sorrow, but of something softer, a yearning so long carried it felt almost foreign to see it laid bare. They touched the bubble gently with a fingertip, and it burst with a shimmer that clung to the air a moment longer than usual.
As though reluctant to let go, the boy shaped his own then.
A wide orb that carried the faint hum of a lullaby. Inside it he saw something hazy, half-formed, himself walking alone, yet at peace, with the bubble stand behind him and the horizon wide before him.
It was not loneliness that filled the bubble, but a calm, a readiness, as though he were learning to carry the stillness wherever he went.
When the bubble burst, he exhaled slowly, accepting that this glimpse was not a promise but a whisper, a dream folded gently into the edges of his path. As the day unfolded, more bubbles revealed themselves, not just reflections of the past, but tender glimpses of what might be. Some were simple, his friend helping another laugh on a day of sorrow, the neighbor carrying a small book, writing words that caught the attention of strangers who paused to listen. The boy himself sitting quietly beside someone unseen, a hand resting softly against his. Others were stranger, dreamlike, filled with shifting colors and distant songs that could not be explained, only felt. Each bubble was a question, a possibility, a glimpse of longing made visible for a heartbeat before dissolving into air. There was one bubble that lingered longer than the rest. It rose from the boy's careful hands and hung still, spinning slowly. Inside it shimmered an image of the three of them, not as they were, but older, their faces softened with time, still gathered at the bubble stand though the wood had worn and the sand shifted. They were not children anymore, but something of their laughter, their patience, their quiet wonder remained. The bubble burst at last, but the feeling it carried stayed with them like an aftertaste of sweetness.
Gentle and impossible to shake, the friend,
ever unable to hold his heart inside, leaned back and whispered, "Do you think the bubbles are telling us what will happen?" The boy shook his head softly. not telling.
Maybe reminding?
Of what we already carry inside. The neighbor looked away toward the sea, their lips pressed together in thought. None of them spoke further, yet the silence felt whole, not empty, as though each was turning over the gift the bubbles had given. As the evening drew near, the bubble stand seemed almost to glow in the fading light, its surface carrying the shimmer of countless dreams released into the air. The boy shaped one final bubble, delicate as breath, and let it rise. Inside it was no clear image, only a faint suggestion, a horizon stretching endlessly, with stars beginning to bloom above. The bubble wobbled, shimmered, and burst into the twilight. The three of them stood together in its wake, their eyes reflecting the last light of day. Walking home that night, the boy felt the quiet settling deeper into his chest. The bubbles had shown them more than memories, more than fleeting reflections. They had revealed something of longing, of possibility, of the quiet ways the future pressed against their hearts, even now. He did not know whether these visions would come true. That wasn't the point. What mattered was the gentle reminder that within each of them lived dreams waiting to be named, waiting to rise, shimmering for a moment before dissolving, yet leaving behind a trace of hope too soft to forget. The bubble stand had grown quiet with familiarity, yet each morning still carried a hush of expectancy, like the first notes of a lullaby played again and again, but never the same twice. The boy approached with slower steps now, not out of weariness but reverence, as though the stand itself had become sacred ground. His friend bounded beside him, laughter still spilling freely but softened into something less wild, more tender. The neighbor no longer lingered at the edges. They stood close now, shoulder brushing shoulder, their silence not from fear, but from a quiet trust. Together, the three of them carried a rhythm, and the bubbles seemed to respond. That morning, the boy shaped the first bubble with a breath so calm it felt like a prayer. The orb rose shimmering, and within its fragile walls appeared not the past, nor a dream of what might be, but something deeper. It showed a ripple, the boy handing a bubble wand to a child smaller than himself, guiding with the same patience he had been learning. Then another ripple, the child laughing, carrying the technique to someone else. And further still, strangers standing together, sharing fragments of wonder, all because of the quiet practice at this stand. The bubble burst, but its image lingered in the boy's chest like a seed. His friend tried next, shaping a bubble larger than usual, his laughter weaving into its form. Inside it shimmered a moment yet to come. Him, sitting beside someone weary, offering a bubble that rose gently and made them smile through tears. It was simple, small, but it radiated like sunlight through water. When the bubble burst, his friend's eyes shone with quiet awe.
"It's not just for us," he whispered, almost to himself.
"It's for anyone who needs it." The neighbor's bubble was different. They breathed slowly, carefully, and released a sphere that carried not brightness but stillness. Within it was an image of themselves, older, sitting at the edge of the sea, children gathered nearby. They weren't speaking loudly nor leading with grand gestures. They were simply listening, nodding, holding space in silence while the children's voices filled the air. The neighbor watched the bubble quiver, their eyes glistening as it burst into mist.
"It's enough," they murmured.
Even silence can ripple. The boy felt something shift in that moment, as though the bubbles were no longer only mirrors of the heart, but vessels carrying fragments of legacy, the soft marks each life leaves upon another. He realized that bubbles, fragile though they were, did not vanish without leaving something behind.
Even when they burst, they left droplets clinging to skin, a shimmer of memory, a trace of having been.
The technique itself was not about mastery, but about carrying a tenderness forward, letting it pass quietly from one person to the next. Throughout the day, the three of them practiced in silence, each bubble carrying glimpses of how their small acts of kindness might outlive them in ways unseen. A bubble drifted, showing the friend's laughter echoing in someone else's heart long after he had gone. Another showed the neighbors listening, shaping the courage of a younger soul. One revealed the boy's patience reflected in a child who would one day guide someone else. The images were brief, fleeting, but together they formed a tapestry, a soft map of how lives, though fragile, left marks that stretched beyond the horizon. By evening, the air above the bubble stand shimmered with countless bursts of possibility. The friend leaned back on the sand, sighing with contentment. "It's strange," he said softly.
They disappear so quickly, but somehow...
"They stay," the neighbor nodded, their voice low, steady. "Like us, like everything. Gone and yet never gone." The boy didn't speak. Instead, he dipped his hands once more, forming a final bubble. Inside it shimmered not a single image, but a scattering of tiny ripples stretching outward, further and further, until they vanished into a light too vast to follow. He released it without guiding its path. It floated high, wobbling gently, catching the fading gold of dusk until it burst against the air, scattering droplets that glistened for a breath before sinking back into the sea breeze. They sat together in silence then, watching the last colors of the day fade into night. The bubble stand stood behind them, quiet but alive, as if holding the memory of all that had been shared. The boy felt a deep calm settle within him, the kind that comes not from answers, but from a growing acceptance. The bubbles had shown them that their lives, fragile though they seemed, carried legacies of gentleness, of laughter, of listening. It wasn't about grand deeds or lasting monuments. It was about the ripples, soft, invisible, endless. And as the stars began to bloom above, the boy whispered a thought that had been resting in his chest all day. "We don't need to last forever," he said. "We just need to matter for as long as we're here." His friend reached for his hand. The neighbor leaned close, and together they let the silence answer for them. A silence filled not with emptiness, but with meaning. The days had begun to blur into one another, each morning at the bubble stand unfolding with the same gentle rhythm, and yet beneath the familiarity, the boy could sense something shifting. The air carried a quiet weight now, as if the stand itself was whispering of change. The sea still lapped at the shore in its eternal cadence. The bubbles still rose and burst in their shimmering dances. But there was a new undercurrent, an unspoken knowing that this chapter was drawing near its end. The boy lingered longer at the edge of the stand before beginning, his fingers tracing the wood as though memorizing its texture. His friend noticed, tilting his head with a smile meant to be easy, but there was hesitation in his laughter. The neighbor, ever perceptive, said nothing, only watched with eyes that seemed to understand what the boy himself had not yet spoken aloud. That morning's first bubble rose from the boy's hands with unusual heaviness. Inside its fragile walls, he glimpsed himself walking away from the bubble stand, his figure growing smaller as the horizon widened before him. The friend called out from behind, waving, smiling bravely though his eyes glistened. The neighbor remained at the stand, still and steady, their hands resting on the wood as though guarding it for the next soul who would arrive. The boy gasped softly, and the bubble burst before he could steady it. Droplets clung to his hands, cool as tears. He tried again, but each bubble seemed to carry the same message. Variations of parting, different paths opening before him, the stand fading behind. With each vision, the truth grew harder to ignore. The bubble stand was not a place meant to keep him forever. It was a place of learning, of shaping, of listening to the silence between breaths. And when the lesson was absorbed, the time came to step beyond its shelter. The friend, sensing the heaviness, reached out and touched the boy's arm. "It doesn't mean you lose it," he said softly. His usual laughter quieted into something tender.
"It just means..."
"You carry it with you, wherever you go." The neighbor finally spoke, their voice calm but edged with gravity. The stand is not bound to this place. It lives in your breath, your stillness, your care. You could walk 1,000 miles and the stand would walk with you. But to remain here forever would be to keep the gift locked inside. It is meant to ripple outward. The boy closed his eyes, listening to the words, though his heart trembled at the thought of leaving. He remembered the first bubble he had blown, clumsy and fleeting, and how far he had come since then. He remembered the silence of the neighbor, the laughter of his friend, the countless images the bubbles had shown, of past, of present, of futures, yet unformed. The thought of stepping away felt like tearing a page from a story he had not yet finished reading. And yet perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the story was not meant to be contained in one place, but to flow like water, like breath, like bubbles drifting to the sky. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the three of them sat together without blowing another bubble. The friend leaned against the boy, his laughter quiet now but no less warm. The neighbor sat close, steady as the tide. They said little, for words felt too sharp for what the heart already knew. Instead, they listened to the sea and to the silence, both of which seemed to hum with farewell. The boy whispered at last,
"I don't know how to go." The neighbor placed a hand over his, their voice gentle as dusk.
"The same way you learned to begin."
"One breath at a time." The boy nodded, his throat tight.
He looked at the bubble stand, at the wood worn smooth by countless hands, at the tools that had guided him, at the space that had given shape to his silence. He knew he would return, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not for a long time, but the stand would always remain within him, as much a part of him as his own breath. And when he walked away, he would not be leaving it behind. He would be carrying it forward to places unseen, to lives not yet touched. The stars rose one by one, and the three of them sat beneath their glow, not as teacher and learners, nor as boy and companions, but as equals, souls bound by the fragile beauty of what they had shared. The night stretched on, tender and endless, holding them in its embrace. And though the boy's heart ached at the thought of departure, beneath the ache was something steadier, something luminous, a quiet acceptance, a readiness blooming like dawn. The morning broke with a pale hush, the kind of dawn that seemed almost reluctant to stir the world awake. The sea lay still, its surface smooth as glass, and the bubble stand waited in silence, every plank of wood steeped in memory. The boy arrived earlier than usual, his steps slow, deliberate, as if savoring each sound of the sand beneath his feet. The air smelled of salt and something faintly sweet, like the breath of a new beginning waiting just beyond the horizon. His friend was already there, leaning against the side of the stand. His usual grin softened into something quieter, tenderer. When he saw the boy, he raised a hand in greeting, but neither of them spoke. Words seemed unnecessary, perhaps even too heavy for the delicate balance of that morning. Soon after, the neighbor approached, their presence as steady as ever, though their eyes carried a knowing that the boy could not meet without his chest tightening. For a while, they simply stood together, watching the empty sea as it caught the first threads of sunlight. The bubble stand creaked gently in the breeze, as though sighing, as though whispering its approval. The boy placed his hand on the wood, feeling its familiar texture, the grooves and edges pressed into his palm. Every mark told a story, of laughter, of learning, of silence, shared in sacred patience. It had become more than a stand. It had become a vessel of everything he had grown into. Finally the boy reached for the tools, his breath steady but his heart racing. He lifted the bubble wand, and for the last time at this stand, he inhaled deeply and let his breath flow outward. A single bubble formed, larger than any he had ever made, shimmering with colors that shifted like dreams. Inside it he saw all that had been, the clumsy beginnings, the shared laughter, the quiet guidance, the moments of stillness where truth had spoken louder than any words. He saw himself as he had been, and as he was now, standing taller, steadier, yet still tender in the heart. The bubble floated upward, carried by the morning light, rising higher and higher until it was nothing more than a speck against the brightening sky.
None of them moved until it vanished completely.
Then the friend laughed, though the sound trembled at the edges, and said softly, "That one will never burst." "Not really?" The boy smiled faintly, though his throat ached. He turned to his companions, his gaze lingering on them as if trying to imprint every detail into his memory, the warmth of his friend's smile, the calm depth of the neighbor's presence. "I don't want to leave," he admitted, his voice breaking like a wave against stone. The neighbor's hand rested on his shoulder, grounding him.
"You are not leaving, you are carrying.
Everything you've learned here, everyone you've shared this with, it goes with you. The stand has already given you what you need. Now it is time to give it to the world." The boy closed his eyes, letting the truth of those words seep into him. When he opened them again, the horizon looked different, not distant, but calling. He took one final breath at the bubble stand, tasting the salt, the sunlight, the echoes of laughter, and he knew it would always live in him. Slowly, he stepped back from the stand. His friend walked beside him, their laughter quiet but real, while the neighbor remained at the edge, watching with a serene pride. The boy looked back once, seeing the bubble stand framed in the golden light of dawn. It did not look smaller as he walked away. It looked eternal, like a flame that could never be extinguished. The sand stretched before him, endless and open, and though his chest ached with the sweetness of farewell, his steps grew lighter with each stride. He was walking not into emptiness, but into possibility, into stories yet unwritten, carrying with him the stand, the bubbles, the silence, the laughter. And as the horizon widened, he realized that this was not an ending. It was the breath before the next beginning. The boy's footsteps grew quieter as he moved farther from the bubble stand, but he never felt alone. Each grain of sand seemed to hum with memory. Each wave carried the faint echo of laughter, and the sky itself held the shimmer of that last great bubble. He walked on, his heart heavy with sweetness, but not with sorrow. Behind him, the bubble stand stood as it always had, simple and unassuming, yet now it was more than wood and nails. It was a keeper of beginnings, a place where a boy had learned that even the smallest breath could shape something vast and beautiful. It would remain, waiting in silence for whoever might wander near, teaching again in its quiet way. He paused once more, looking back. The stand was bathed in morning light, glowing softly, as if it understood. The boy lifted his hand in a silent farewell, and for a brief moment he thought he heard the stand sigh with contentment, like an old friend wishing him well. Turning back to the horizon, he breathed in deeply. The air felt new, but inside him was the rhythm of all that had come before, every shared smile, every gentle word, every bubble that had risen and drifted into the sky. It was enough. It was everything. And as the day unfolded, he carried that secret gift with him. The knowledge that quiet things often last the longest, and that love, once shared, never truly leaves. And somewhere, if you listen closely, the bubble stand is still there, waiting, whispering, shimmering in the light, teaching the art of turning breath into wonder. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man.